I have a request. I don't think Sloan is here. Would anybody be willing to? Oh, is she? Okay, next week. Would anybody be willing to pass around the? We do have Sunday school. Tell Sloan it's elder Q&A. She can pass around the mic. No, oh, Mike. Rob, thank you. Okay, we're in Exodus chapter 15 through 17 today, but let's begin with prayer. God, I thank you for your word. I pray that you would instill it not only in our minds, but in our hearts and in our souls, so that we live out what we heard and what we've learned. Lord, there's so much depth to the scriptures, but also so much that's simple and plain about how you want us to live and what you're like. And I just pray that you would open our mind to it and fill us with a desire to know and also a desire to do what you've called us to do. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're in Exodus, but I first want to start by looking at Psalm 105 and 106. If you have a Bible, would you turn there? Psalm 105 and Psalm 106, I think, was originally one really long psalm. And it's an interesting combination, because Psalm 105 talks about how faithful and good God was during the Exodus, how he saved them, brought them into the land, all the things. Exodus 106 talks about how faithless the people were when God brought them out. So let's look at some of this. This is Psalm 105. Look at verse 5 and 6. Remember the wonders he's done, his miracles and the judgment he pronounced. And he starts listing these things. So look at verse 23 now. Then Israel entered Egypt, and Jacob lived as an alien in the land of Ham. And the Lord made his people very fruitful, and he made them too numerous for their foes, whose hearts he turned to hate his people and conspire against them. Let's look at verse 39 now. God spread out a cloud as a covering, and fire to give light at night. They asked, and he brought them quail and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and the water gushed out. Like a river, it flowed in the desert. We're going to be learning those things later. Verse 42. For he remembered his holy promise given to his servant Abraham. He brought his people out with rejoicing, his chosen one with shouts of joy. He gave them the lands of the nations, and they fell heir to what others had toiled for. And then he ends in verse 45 with the reason that God was so faithful and God did all these things for Israel. It's so that they might keep his precepts and obey his laws. So this is the picture. All of Israel's history, God has been so good. Just from Abraham all the way through the Exodus, all the way into the land, he's just done all these things for his people, just provided for them, did miracles for them, gave them food and water in the desert and all these things so that they might keep his precepts, observe his laws, be faithful to him. Now let's look at 106, Psalm 106. Jump down to 6 and 7. We have sinned, even as our fathers did. We've done wrong and acted wickedly. When our fathers were in Egypt, they gave no thought to your miracles. They did not remember your many kindnesses. They rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. Verse 13. But they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his counsel. In the desert they gave into their cravings, and in the wasteland they put God to the test. He gave them what they asked for, but sent a wasting disease upon them. Look at, this is sort of the rest. I'll just talk about what happens. The Israelites, he says, they grew envious of Moses and Aaron. They made a calf idol and exchanged the glorious God for an image of a bull. They despised the pleasant land. They didn't believe the promises. They grumbled in their hearts, it says. They yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, that's Numbers chapter 25, and aroused the Lord's anger by their wicked deeds. They did not destroy the nations in the land of Canaan like God had commanded them, but they mingled with the nations instead. They worshiped their idols. They sacrificed their children to false god, it says later in 106. They shed innocent blood. They defiled themselves and they prostituted themselves. And so here we have on Psalm 105, God's faithfulness. And here we see their response. Just utter unfaithfulness, lack of love, grumbling, complaining, and sin. And look at 106, verse 43. It says, he caused them to be pitied. Sorry, that's not right. Verse 43. Many times he delivered them, but they were bent on rebellion, and they wasted away in their sin. So, finally, at the end of the chapter, verse 47, actually, it says, the author says, save us, Lord our God, and gather us from the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. And so, the author wrote this years after the Exodus, actually when they had been exiled to Babylon, right? During the time of Ezekiel and those people, and Jeremiah. And so they're in this terrible situation. Why? Because they preferred sin to following the Lord. And this story, the story of Israel, should make us consider our own stories, right? On the one hand, we can see, right, how God has been faithful to us. He's been good to us. He's done miracles in our lives before. And he's been kind to us, not because of anything we've deserved, right? But what has our response been? That's the question. Are we following the same path as Israel without realizing it? And does the way we live match the wonderful faithfulness and love that God has shown to us? That's the question. And so, last week we finished up studying one of the greatest acts of God's power and love. He parted the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, and brought Israel out as his people. They sang with joy and triumph on the other side of the sea, and the Egyptians were drowned. It was just an amazing thing. That's where we ended, at the end of chapter 15 in Exodus. But today, even in chapter 15, after that, their singing turns to grumbling. And it only took them 3 days from just being, exultant about how good God had been to them to grumbling and complaining, right? And God responds with further miracles, but that whole generation that God brought through the Reed Sea, that all those people, they rebelled and grumbled against him, except for a couple, Caleb and Joshua. All of that, they grumbled against God, the God who saved them from slavery. And because of the way they lived their lives, they never made it to the promised land. And they definitely could have if they'd been faithful. And so, what was the source of all that complaining and rebellion? Well, look at 15. We're going to go from chapter 15, verse 22 through 17, verse 7 today. And look at what this is. They complain at the end of 15 about water. They complain about food in chapter 16, not having enough. And in 17, they complain about water again. Okay? Now, they are upset about food and drink and not having enough. At my house, a lot of the grumbling happens and bad attitudes happen because of food and drink as well, right? The kids, they get hungry and dinner's not ready yet. And so there's complaining, there's fussiness, and fighting happens between them. But that should teach us something about ourselves as well. If the cravings of our flesh must be met before we can be happy and willing to obey God and trust him, then we're in real trouble. We need to trust God even when the cravings of our flesh are not satisfied. And this is one of the advantages from practicing fasting as a spiritual discipline. It breaks the power of craving for food or for other things in the flesh so that we can learn to obey God no matter how we feel, right? So God was teaching them that in a major way in this chapter. Not a voluntary fast, but. So look at these three incidents. In chapter 15, 22 through 27, all of chapter 16 with the manna, and then the beginning of 17. There are two words that keep cropping up over and over again in these three stories. First, the word test, testing. God tests Israel at Marah, that's chapter 15. He tests them with the manna in chapter 16, and then Israel tests God in chapter 17 at Meribah. And so I have a question for you, and Rob has a mic, and we need you to speak in the mic because we're recording this. But here's the question. Do you think God ever tests us like he tested the Israelites? Does he test us in the same way? What do you think? Is that yes? We don't need that on the That's probably the best answer anyway. Yes. You think so? So how do you know then if you're being tested?
Perhaps I'm being tested right now.
Not that kind of test.
You do not have the joy of the Lord, the peace of the Lord rule in your heart if you are fighting a test. And which test do you want me to tell? The Lord has tested me in so many ways that feeling sorry for oneself is obviously you're going through a test. Your mind is off of Christ and onto you or something else rather than on Christ. And our faith, that's what's being tested. Our faith in Him in situations. Now, I have passed a few too. I haven't lost them all. But our faith will weaken or get stronger when we're in a test.
Depending on it.
I could
pass it or
I
not.
could take the whole time answering this. I'm trying to avoid that.
Well, that's okay. That's a good answer, what you gave.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anybody else have something they'd like to share? Al? And then Janine behind him.
This is a one-liner from a Bible instructor at my Bible school that I went to. The devil tempts you to break you. The Lord tests you to make you.
That's good. We love one-liners, don't we, as Americans? Janine has something there. Right here, Rob.
The test refines you, and it takes the dross out. So, and hopefully you'll rely on the Lord then.
Yeah. So that's its purpose: is to do us good, to build us up in our faith, to refine us. What was it? Al? Not build you. To make us. That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
But I asked the Lord why things were going like they were, because I was thinking of situations that weren't fun. His answer was to me, I am refining you. It wasn't the situation that was so important. What was important is that my character was being sanctified.
Yeah, good. So that's one word that continues over and over again, testing. So God tests the Israelites for their good. The Israelites end up testing God, and we'll talk about that later. Another word is grumbling, which I mentioned already. The word in Hebrew means to grumble or murmur, to complain, to argue, to protest. And it occurs 8 times from 1522 until 1707. Over and over again, they're grumbling, right? And there's a Greek version of the Old Testament. Originally it was written in Hebrew, right? But there's a Greek version called the Septuagint. And the word that's used for grumbling there is the same word used in John 6 in our passage, right after the part I taught in my sermon, where the people grumble about Jesus when he says, you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood, or you'll have, and and they grumble and they leave. They actually don't follow him. And then there's one more thing in these. There's a theme about knowing that the Lord is God. And so out of the testing is supposed to come knowing. Yahweh proves himself faithful to his promises, his loving care. He'll send bread from heaven so that you'll know that he is God. And so that's part of our testing too, is to know. Is there anybody up there? No. I had a PowerPoint and I forgot about it. Shoot. Well, it was a PowerPoint to show pictures of what it was like on their travels. So we know sort of the basic area where they were going and have an idea of where they stopped in all these places. And, you've seen pictures of deserts, right? And like the Sahara is just all sand and just nothingness. That's like what this place is like as they travel down into the Sinai Peninsula. There's just nothing there. And what they called oases, or places that they would stop, were just, there's a few trees growing. It's basically all it is, because there's a little bit of water somewhere. And so they travel, and this is 1522. They travel to Mara and Elim. So let's look at 22 through 27. Then Moses, 15:22 through 27. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. And for 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. And when they came to Mara, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Mara. Mara means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Now, I'll stop there for a second. They've been in a desert. They've been traveling for 3 days, and they haven't had water. Is that a big deal? Yeah, that's a huge deal. I mean, people say, right, you can survive 3 days without water. The rule of 3 days without water, 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 weeks without food is kind of the rule of thumb that survivalists have. And so they hadn't drank water. They'd been traveling in a desert. They would have been very fatigued, very confused, very overheated. What happens when you're really tired and, you don't get what you want? You grumble and you complain, right? And so that's what they did. And so they get to this place. They were probably so relieved they saw water, right, at Mara. They go down there, they start drinking it, and it must have been terrible because they were about to die from thirst and they couldn't drink it still, right? It was so bitter. And so their response was, in verse 24, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" And Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So here's the thing. We can say, how could these people possibly grumble? Just 3 days after the Lord saved them from the Red Sea. I mean, they just saw God totally take care of them in miraculous ways. And he did so many things right before their eyes. They can see the cloud, of the pillar of cloud right in front of them. And they grumble, they complain, they doubt, right? At this, what's that? Sounds up to date. That's right. How can they have so little faith? But they had, like I just said, they had no water for 3 days. They had kids and elderly people they were taking care of, livestock. Their situation was incredibly desperate. And if they just waited a few more hours, people were going to start dying, I bet. Maybe people already had, we don't know. Have you ever grumbled for less than that? Have you? Yes. 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 Oh. So maybe that's why, if you read this part of the story, God does not chastise them for grumbling here. He doesn't say, "Oh, how dare you," right? He says, Moses cries out to the Lord, and he shows him a piece of wood, though I think probably in Hebrew it's more closer to a whole tree, like a little tree. And he shows him that, and he says, "Throw it in the water." He does, and it becomes sweet. Now, does that miracle remind you of anything that's happened before or after in the Bible? Micah? Yep, staff, the Nile water turning into blood, undrinkable. And so here, turning water into something drinkable. I don't know if this is right, but I often think of turning water into wine, Jesus doing that. Sweet, yeah. And so it's interesting that there's such a desperate situation, and it's so easy for God to fix. Oh yeah, there's a tree right there. All you have to do is throw it in the water, right? And yet they couldn't see it. They didn't know. And so, apparently there are trees in that area that can dull bitterness of taste, right? Research has been done and things like that. And so some Bible scholars will go back and forth. Was this really a miracle? Like they just took a tree that works or whatever. Well, ancient people wouldn't have thought like that. There's not a divide between supernatural and natural. Like God put that tree there. He showed Moses. He put it there hundreds of years ago just for this situation. Of course it's a miracle, right? Whatever it is. And so now he's provided for them. They've had a drink. And now, God issues the test, right? So look at verse 26 and 27. 25. Lord made a decree and a law for them. And there he tested them, and he said, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So notice that the test was not the lack of water, but the command God gives in verse 16. The test is if they listen to God and do what's right in his eyes and pay attention to his commands, right? Sometimes we think that the trial is the test, which in some ways it is. It's related, right? But it's really the occasion for the test. The test is always, are you going to pay attention to what God says? Are you going to obey him? Sometimes the occasion for the test makes it really hard to do that, in our eyes at least, to obey him and be faithful. And yet the real test, what God is really looking for, is if we're going to continue to follow his word, right? So they leave there, they go to Elim in verse 27, and they stay there. Elim's kind of nice. It's got palm trees, they're camped near water, they're probably happy, right? Now we're on to chapter 16. They've been there for a month. They've camped there in that nice place, and now God tells them to move on. I wonder how they felt about that, right? They move on, and by verse 2, look at this. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve us and this entire assembly to death. Okay, so just get this. They're so miserable that they wished that they had died in all the plagues. Wow. That's mind-blowing and sad. And notice that at every instance of grumbling, look at what Moses does. He takes it to the Lord. He doesn't try to solve the crisis. He takes it to the Lord, and the Lord responds. So going to God is his immediate response in the crisis. And they have a lot of crisis out in the wilderness. Everybody has crises all the time. It's just part of life, right? But he takes it to the Lord. But this is bad. They want to go back to Egypt. They're missing their life of slavery. They say we sat around pots of food and got to eat what we wanted, right? And I think, do you see a parallel between this and when people first become Christians after living their life apart from Christ? They become Christians, maybe things are fine for a while, and then, things were better back then when I could do what I wanted to do and not feel guilty about it, right? When I could fulfill the cravings of my flesh, and they forget the miserableness of their slavery apart from Christ and what he's delivered them from. And it's so easy to forget. Yes, Bob.
One of the secrets of the powers that you have as a believer is that when you are facing a test or a crisis, the struggle is not in the flesh. It's that you can talk to God. And we need to learn to talk to God and get his answers and follow them. For instance, this is how I feel in my heart. It wasn't the tree that healed the water. It was the Lord himself that healed the water. Well, why then was the tree important? Because Moses prayed and God directed him to the tree. He obeyed God's direction and put the tree in the water, and it was healed. The secret is when we pray in a stressful situation, and if we listen to God, and he puts in our heart a sense of something to do, do it. That's the right thing to do, because God loves to give answers to prayer. If we don't listen and follow the instruction, we'll never know those. That can go on through the manna and everything. Praying, you'll find that Moses goes to God in prayer throughout this whole passage and many situations. And he then knows what to do. He obeys God, and victories come. This is probably the biggest lesson of what you're teaching us to not be grumblers, but prayers. And not be talking to God only, listening to him. And not only be listening, but have the courage to do what he says. Sometimes it's very odd that you do. But Wanda and I have experienced so many answers to prayer, which we never would have had if we wouldn't have prayed.
Yeah, sometimes the opposite of complaining is probably praying. I think that's a good point.
Jesus changes the bitterness of our hearts by dying on a tree.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, James. Notice that in both this, so the water, he turns the bitterness of the water, and now he's about to send manna. That God does not do anything until they ask. In fact, actually, they don't usually ask. They complain, and then Moses asks, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, can you ask that again?
So my question is, they go to Moses. Why isn't Moses saying, okay, people, let's gather together, let's pray about this? But it says Moses went to the Lord, which, don't get me wrong, it's the right thing to do, but are we not teaching the people, you need to go to the Lord? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah.
To me, there's a teaching moment here, and it got lost.
Well, remember, this was a new thing
Well, exactly.
to them. And these people didn't feel like they had access to God. They felt like they had to go through Moses. And yet at the same time, all the blame, all the responsibility gets put on Moses instead of on God. And they should have learned, like you're saying, not to wait till the last minute. But look, what do? We wait till it's a desperate crisis. We go through all our options, and then, right here, Rob, right here. And then once we've exhausted everything, then we go to God.
One little thing, why didn't Moses? Well, understand that the Lord has worked with people progressively through time. There wasn't anybody in that day, not even Moses, that could do this and hold a book. Okay, it was not written. He was going to pen the first 5 books, but not yet. And the people in bondage there in Egypt were formed into what would be a nation. They were actually being, I think, protected from the corruptions of Canaan, and also being protected in Egypt in a culture that would not intermix with them. And that would have happened back in Canaan. So the Lord did something in those 400 years that they were in Egypt. Then the Lord raises up a great prophet for them, and in the Jews' mind, the greatest of the prophets, Moses. And what Moses shows is he is the mediator between God and men. And that was a big lesson for them. So, why didn't Moses? Well, nobody thought they had access to God in the way that we do in a New Testament. We are New Covenant believers. Moses is going to bring in the Old Covenant. So all of that is before we are. And so you just sort of have to, things weren't then what they are now. I mean, that's a little bit of the answer to your question. But Moses is being presented as the mediator between God and men. God has always worked mediatorally. That's still going on today, but we have one in heaven who's better than Moses. So you and I have an access before the throne that no one in those ancient times would have expected or even wanted. Didn't the people, when they get to the Mount Sinai, we will not see the face of the Lord, Moses, you go. And of course, that led to its own problems too, right? The problem with the way the Lord has dealt with men is at every step men are tested, and at every step men have failed.
Thanks, Pastor. So, God says, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. I'll fix this problem. Again, he doesn't chastise them. But from this day onward, he sends manna every day for 40 years, until they reach the land of Canaan. When they first take their step in Canaan, then it stops. And it was so much so that every day they ate this bread that they actually start complaining about it. So in Numbers 11, they say, we're tired of this stuff. Give us something good. I think it sounds like it tasted like honey, but they got tired of it, and the rabble among them started to crave other food. But God will use this, the manna, to test them to see if they're going to follow his command, just like before. So the first test is, and we won't read it, but I'll just explain it. They're only to gather manna for that day. They're not supposed to gather more than what they need for that day. And so the question is, what is that supposed to teach them? God is teaching them that he can be trusted to give them food and what they need every single day. Right? They don't need to hoard. And it's kind of like Jesus teaches on the Sermon on the Mount, that you don't need to worry about what you eat or drink or wear. Each day has enough worries of its own. Trust God with what's coming the next day, right? And it's not just an American thing, it's a human thing. We want to be so set for the future where we don't have to worry, we don't have to, you know what it is? So set we don't have to trust. And I wonder what would happen to us if we were in a desert with no food. What would we do? Would we trust God if we picked up manna? Would we trust him to give him manna for the next day, seeing how hungry we were before? And there was another test too. They were to gather twice as much on the 6th day, so that they wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath by collecting food on the 7th, right? And so they were only supposed to gather enough for one day, all the other days a week. But on the 6th day, they were supposed to gather twice the amount. And what was that supposed to teach them? Is that God can give extra food in abundance so that they can obey him. And I think we often think that if we're going to do what God says, there's going to be a lack. If they're going to obey the Sabbath, well, they just won't be able to eat that day, so it's going to be really hard. No, that's not how God works, right? If someone gives up a job so that they can follow Jesus better, they think, well, am I going to be poor? Am I going to have a lack? No, God will provide, right? If we do his will, he's going to give us what we need. And that's the test that he's trying to get them to learn. There's going to be extra food on Friday, right? So you can obey him on Saturday. And look at verse 6 through 8. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you'll know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt." Hear that? You will know that it was. "And in the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord, because he's heard your grumbling. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" So in the evening he's going to send them quail. I didn't mention that part. Just fill the camp with meat, right? And in the morning he's going to send them manna. And Moses, I like this. He makes it clear. You're grumbling against me? This isn't about me. I'm just a person. I can't do anything. Who are we, he says, that you're grumbling against us? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. And I think that we also need to realize this about grumbling and complaining. When we grumble and complain, no matter what it is, it's not against human beings. It's not against situations. It's against the Lord who makes human beings and who is sovereign over every situation and circumstance. I read a quote once, I think maybe it was William Law or William Temple or something, but he said, even a complaint about the weather is a complaint about the Lord who made the weather. We think it's so simple, and it comes so quickly to our lips. Do you like being complained about, grumbled against? Nobody does. The Lord hates it. He hates it. You can tell how much it bothers him as the Pentateuch goes on, that this is just something that really bothers God. Because it shows people don't trust if they're complaining. Those two do not go together, right? And so in verse 13, the manna comes down, they see it, and you remember what they said? What is this? All right, what is it? The word manna actually just means what is it? That's what the word means. And they didn't know, but there's a description of what it is in verse 31. Look at this. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Sounds pretty good, right? I suppose if that was all you ate, that could get a little tiring. Man, we have more choices with food and drink than ever in history. Like, the only drink that they had was wine and water. Those were the two options for centuries, right? And look at how many we have. And food, man, that should make us thankful as well. But no matter how much people gathered, there was always enough for them, right? And so verse 17 and 18, the Israelites did as they were told, and some gathered much and some little. And when they measured it out by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Now, Paul uses that and quotes that in 2 Corinthians 8 when talking about the importance of giving. And so this is what he says. This is 2 Corinthians 8, 10 through 15. And here's my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first not only to give, but also to have a desire to do so. Now finish the work so that the eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable to the one who has it, not according to what the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Our desire is not that others be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. As it is written, here's where he quotes it, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. And so the point that Paul's making from this passage is that we don't need to hoard our possessions or our money or our food. We need to share with others, and we'll still have enough when we do that. People who gathered much had enough. The people who gathered little had enough. Why? Because we have a God who provides for us like he's always provided enough manna for the Israelites. To not give to the work of the Lord or to other people who have a need because we're afraid that we're not going to have enough is pretty much like an Israelite who does not trust that God is going to provide manna the next day. That's the correlation that he's trying to make. And so we have in this passage people gathering manna, but already they fail the test. In verse 20, some of them paid no attention to Moses' command about not gathering on the Sabbath, and they go out on Saturday, and verse 20, paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning. So they're supposed to eat it all that day so that they can trust the Lord with the rest. But they ate some and kept the rest so that they would have another meal the next day. And it says that it was so full of maggots and began to smell. That's what happened when they tried to hoard it for themselves. It rotted. This reminds me of stories of like foster kids, who come from a home where they didn't have enough food, and they'll take food from the table and hide it in their rooms and things like that. It's just that they don't trust their parents yet, that there's going to be dinner the next day. And so that's what hoarding, especially money, that's what it is. It's a lack of trust in some ways. Like Jesus said, do not store up treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy. Remember the parable of the guy in Luke 12, the rich man who had a plentiful harvest? Instead of sharing it, he just built bigger barns to store all of it for later. And God said, you fool, I'm going to take your night tonight, today. James criticizes the rich people in the church. In chapter 5, he says, you've hoarded wealth in the last days when there were poor people that they could have shared with. And so this is a constant thing. It's not just about, you got to give or whatever. Giving is an act of trust. It's an act of trust in God that he will provide for you the next day, right? He will always sustain you, and you've got to put your life in his hands. And he taught them that. He tested them that in a very real, tangible way. Just collect enough for that day. Don't hold it till the next. All right. Let me finish with this. Some people went out on the Sabbath to gather. They disobeyed in that way, and they failed the test. And I want you to notice that the reason why people do not obey God in this passage and in every other passage, the reason behind the disobedience was a lack of trust that God would provide. Right? A lot of our disobedience to the word of the Lord comes from a lack of trust, though we don't always see it that way. We want our cravings to be fulfilled, and we think we need to go out and do it. We don't trust that God will provide not just what we need financially or whatever like that. He'll meet our needs and our desires as well. And that's something that I think comes from a constant learning and putting your trust in the Lord, that he provides for all those things. Adam and Eve failed that test too, right? They thought that God was withholding something good from them, and they had to get it themselves, that fruit. And so often we do that as well, instead of just trusting that if I obey, God is going to make my life good. Even when it's hard, it'll be good. He'll provide, he'll meet my needs. He's also going to meet my real desires that are satisfying in my heart. And I just have to trust and obey. Well, I didn't make it through chapter 17 when they test the Lord. I'll have to pick that up in 2 weeks from now. So, and sorry about that PowerPoint. That would have been fun to have, but we'll use it next time, hopefully. All right, thanks.
Faith support. Yeah. We learned